Non-whites. Whites only. I feel very angry. I thought apartheid does not exist anymore in Namibia. What's this now? I feel very angry about this.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Non-white only and white only in Namibia. What's this coming from again? Our parents fight for this and it's coming again. We lost our parents and our uncles die in exile. What is this? Namibia. This is a democratic country. I'm telling you. This will not happen and will not work and will not going, and I'm telling you, we will fight for it.
Thank you so much. Well, I apologize if we have given you all a scare, viewers. The world is in fact okay. There is no such things as public areas for specific races only. And in Namibia is a modern democracy where this will never occur again. But viewers, imagine this is what our fathers and mothers faced every day for over 40 years under South African rule. Today we are talking about the attraction that apartheid as a system had for the rulers in 1948. We'll talk about the reasons why South Africa legislated apartheid, the types of laws that constituted apartheid in the 1948 period, and how the world viewed apartheid legislation. It is a hard topic for some of us to bear, as it is so close to home. But thanks for watching. Apartheid is the Afrikaans word for separation. Apartheid was a racial and social policy which the National Party government of South Africa introduced in 1948. And until 1990, this policy remained enforced in South Africa and Namibia.
Class, there are racial divisions and hatred in many countries. We know that. So then, what was so bad and so different in the way South Africa did it?
Black people weren't allowed to buy white bread.
South Africans never wanted blacks to learn how to read and write. Basically, they wanted them to stay uneducated.
That's right. What made South Africa's apartheid era different from the segregation and racial hatred that have occurred in other countries was the systematic way in which the National Party formalized it through law. The National Party of South Africa came into power in 1948. It was called a national party, but of course, only white people could participate in politics at that time. The NP government began enacting laws to classify and enforce the divisions of the races.
But where did this idea come from?
Look at this man. D.F. Malan, who was Prime Minister from 1948, followed by H.F. Verwoerd, who was the Premier from 1958 until he was assassinated in 1966. These men were the chief designers of apartheid.
Well, sir, how did they do it?
The term apartheid literally means apartness. You have heard of the saying, divide and rule. Well, the nationalist government of South Africa also heard of that one. So the apartheid legislation consisted of different laws which were written to help the white government enforce the separation of different races, thereby strengthening the power and the dominance by whites over the other race groups. Thus, we say that with the passing of apartheid laws in 1948, racial discrimination was institutionalized. They became a system of governance.
But sir, I still don't see how dividing the black people made them weaker.
Of course, it did not make them weak as individuals, but they did not have any combined political say, and they were also not given any economic opportunities. So that is why they could not achieve anything on a political scene unless someone from the outside gave them those things. And that is what happened eventually. But we will talk about this another day. You see, without money and some authority, people are powerless. And it is a technique that some men use to make their wives powerless too. The facts are, the effect of the legislation was consistently favorable to the whites and unfavorable to the non-white racial groups. These non-white groups were namely the blacks, Indians, and coloreds. The whites comprised only about 20% of the nation's population at that time. But this policy of ruling by apartheid ensured that they could continue to dominate the country.
But sir, something bothers me about this
A lot
story.
bothers me about this story.
Yeah, sure, but the blacks were the majority of the population, and some white minority comes in and takes away their money and power just like that. It's as though the blacks or the non-whites were never organized.
An excellent observation. Think about it, class. How can a minority group just suddenly rise up and be the strongest? The answer will not surprise you. Although the policy of apartheid began officially in 1948, when the National Party came into power and decided to rule the country according to this law, the practice of racial discrimination has far deeper roots in the South African society. As early as 1788, Dutch colonizers began establishing laws and regulations that separated white settlers and native Africans. These laws and regulations continued after the British occupation in 1795 and soon led to the settlement of Africans into specific areas that would later constitute their so-called homelands. By 1910, the year that all of the formerly separate Boer republics united with the British colony to become the Union of South Africa, there were nearly 300 reserves for natives throughout the country. So by 1948, when Dr. D.F. Malan led the National Party, the black people had already been pushed outside the political scene. The first campaign was made based on open racism and white unity. The party promised that if elected, it will make the homeland reserves permanent under the joint fundamental principles of separation and trusteeship. The National Party swept into office, winning the majority votes mainly from Afrikaner voters. And once in office, the new government established a number of apartheid policies seeking to ensure the survival of the white race and to keep the different races separate on every level of society and in every facet of life. Among the first acts passed was the Prohibition of Mixed Marriage Act, which outlawed marriage between Europeans and non-Europeans. The following year, new legislation banned sexual relations between Europeans and non-Europeans. And soon the Malan government also passed the Population Registration Act, which categorized every South African by race, and subsequently required people to carry with them a card or pass at all times, stating their racial identity. Anyone caught without this card was fined or imprisoned. But it was the Group Areas Act of 1950 that came to be considered as the core of apartheid in South Africa. The act marked off areas of land for different racial groups, and it made it illegal for people to live in any but their designated areas. Thousands of Africans were uprooted and moved into racial segregated neighborhoods in cities or to their reserves. Even black workers who worked in the residential white-only cities during the day were still required to use different public transport, post office counters, restaurants, schools, and even separate doors and benches. More and more restrictive laws were made. The Natives Urban Areas Act in 1952, the Native Labor Act in 1953.
But sir, did all of this go totally unchallenged?
Good question. Not totally unchallenged, no. There were three important movements that made life very difficult for the National Party in South Africa. The ANC, the PAC, and the SASO. The oldest was the African National Congress, ANC, which was founded in 1912. The Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, broke away from the ANC in 1958 and initiated its own campaign against apartheid. Both groups were later banned by the South African government and forced underground, where they began aggressive campaigns of resistance. And in the late 1960s, the South African Students' Organization, SASO, was formed, which is now known as the Black Consciousness Movement, BCM, in South Africa. Okay. Yes?
But were they effective enough to stop apartheid, sir?
That is the bit of good news we bring you today, learners. Apartheid formally ended in 1994 with the first democratic elections, which allowed the participation of all adult voters of all races. With that election, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa. And the rest, as they say, is history.
That's right, viewers. Finally, even in Namibia, the reminders of the apartheid era are disappearing one by one. And with the freedom we all enjoy in our sunny country today, let's hold hands and build on the strength of all our combined diverse cultures to get better all the time. Let's recap our lesson on the attraction of apartheid in South Africa in 1948. South Africa's apartheid era was different from segregation and racial hatred in other countries by the systematic way in which the National Party formalized it through law. Although the policy of apartheid began officially in 1948 when the National Party came to power and decided to rule the country according to this law, the practice of racial discrimination began as early as 1788 when Dutch colonizers began establishing laws and regulations that separated white settlers and native Africans. These laws and regulations continued after the British occupation in 1795 and soon led to the settlement of Africans into specific areas that would later constitute their so-called homelands. So by 1948, when Dr. D.F. Malan led the National Party, the black people had already been pushed outside of the political scene when the first campaign was made based on open racism and white unity. The party promised that if elected, it would make the homeland reserves permanent under the joint fundamental principles of separation and trusteeship. Only white people could participate in politics in 1948, and the ruling National Party government began enacting laws to classify and enforce division of the races. The architects of institutionalized apartheid were SA Premiers D.F. Malan and H.F. Verwoerd. Laws enforcing separation of different races served to strengthen the power and dominance by whites over the other racial groups. Blacks, coloreds, and Indians were made powerless by being denied any political say and economic opportunities. The whites comprised only about 20% of the nation's population at that time, but the policy of ruling by apartheid ensured that they could continue to dominate the country. Among the first acts passed were laws prohibiting mixed marriages and mixed relationships, and a registration act which categorized every South African by race, requiring people to carry a card or pass stating their racial identity. The Group Areas Act marked off areas of land for different racial groups and made it illegal for people to live in any but their designated areas. Apartheid was eventually challenged by mainly 3 indigenous black South African movements that began mobilizing: the ANC, PAC, and SASO. Apartheid formally ended in 1994 with the first democratic elections, which allowed the participation of adult voters of all races. With that election, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa, and apartheid was done away with in South African politics. I hope you enjoyed watching the program and learning with us. Before we go, here is our SMS competition question. Please SMS us at 5003 and mention the keyword for this lesson, which is apartheid. Then leave a space and type A, B, or C for the answer you choose as the correct one. Each SMS costs $3 Namibian, and here is the question. Tell us which statement from these options you think is correct. Apartheid literally means A, separation of political parties, B, division of different races, or C, superiority of one specific race. The winner will be announced within 3 days, and if it is you, we will contact you to come and collect your prize at a NAMCOL center near wherever you live. Thanks again for watching, and see you soon again. Bye-bye.